So it's a real pleasure to host all of you here at ODI tonight. We have an audience, about 200 people following us online, and it is also a real pleasure and reflection to begin this new year with continuing to maintain this conversation on what we are going to do about this urgent and important debate happening in our country, in Europe, and globally around the reality of human mobility across the world. So tonight we are going to talk about something that, in my view, is just simply not discussed enough in the multitude of migration and displacement conversation happening right now across the world, from the debates in New York and Geneva and elsewhere about the 2 global compacts being negotiated, all the way to the difficult discussions in Europe and indeed in a number of countries. It is remarkable how much across these conversations we continue to make reference to migration as fundamentally, and displacement as fundamentally, the movement of someone from a country of origin that one decides to leave in search for a better life, or one is forced to leave because of conflict or natural disasters, or a debate, a difficult political debate in a country of destination where these migrants and refugees need to be better integrated for different reasons. And we simply ignore or do not talk often about what happens in between. So what happens along the journeys that different people make across different countries, and how much that actually shapes the reality of human mobility, the decisions that people make along the way. And the reason why that's, I think, is a major problem is that we risk actually having a very big blind spot. If you think about how many people are currently engaged in trying to find solutions to this big crisis around migration, and how much we are not considering what's happening, along the ways of the realities of migrants and refugees' journeys. We've just come from a seminar where we presented actually the findings, please, from this excellent book that I need to recommend to all of you, that Heaven will say a bit more about in a minute, the findings of the MedMig project. They interviewed 500 refugees and migrants, I think in 2015, who arrived in Europe, and almost none of them originally set out to come to Europe. So it must mean that somewhere along the way, decisions were made that resulted in this very small number of people actually making their way to Europe. Imagine how many more are along different parts of that journey that we are simply not paying much attention to. When we talk about journeys, we tend to talk about journeys at sea. We seem to not pay enough attention to everything that happens before migrants and refugees set out on a boat, whether it is on the coast of Turkey or of Libya. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk a lot about what happens between the original decision that migrants make to migrate, or the original causes that force refugees to flee particular countries, in between that and what happens afterwards along their journeys. The reason why I think this matters is there are a number of those. First of all, as we think about the solutions for this great big problem, debate about migration, we tend to simply not focus enough on what can be done in between. Secondly, people die or are exposed to great risks on some of those journeys. And again, is not enough to just focus on elements of those, and particularly just focusing to the passage at sea and everything else that people can be exposed to and risk along the ways. And finally, we risk spending a phenomenal amount of money by putting in place solutions either at borders in Europe or in countries of origin to try to tackle root causes that ignore everything that could be done in between. So to me, it is a real pleasure to have a conversation about this often forgotten or simply not well understood aspects of the migration debate. And I really cannot think of anyone better than Kate Adie to help us navigate this debate and have a real conversation about what this all means. Let me briefly introduce Kate, and then I'll hand over to her to chair this event. Most of you, certainly those of you based in Britain, but all over the world, as you listen to the BBC and the BBC World Service, will be familiar with Kate's voice and with Kate's work as the BBC Chief News Correspondent. Of course, one of the first British women to report and send dispatch from war zones and dangerous zones around the world. And of course, today, Kate is the presenter of the BBC programme From a World Correspondence that I personally really enjoy every weekend. So I'm very excited to welcome Kate to ODI. Kate has done amazing things in her life as a journalist. She had memorable assignments including both Gulf Wars, 4 years of wars in the Balkans, the final NATO intervention in Kosovo, and the election in 2000. The Herald of Free Enterprise disaster in Zeebrugge, the massacre in Dunblane, the Selby rail crash, the SAS lifting of the Iran embassy siege in London, the Bologna railway terrorist attack, which I was not aware of, and I remember very well being in Italy at the time, what it all meant for our own country history, and the Tiananmen Square protest in 1989. And you will not be surprised to know that she was therefore awarded an OBE in 1993. So Kate, welcome to ODI, and thank you for accepting our invitation. Over to you.
Very kind of you. Thank you so much. You will have gathered from that, and I'm an absolute dinosaur. In the time that I reported, I've been across a lot of borders. I've also, I suppose, seen a lot of people on the move. And I am by no means, though, an expert. I'm an observer, a witness, which is what a journalist aims to do. We've got the experts here. We'll be hearing from them in a moment. Each will make a presentation. And then we go to the Q&A, and I want to involve as many people as possible. Please keep your questions short. Could you keep your statements or particularly lengthy view an enormous and fascinating story that you have until we have our reception. Afterwards, there will be a chance to go into detail then. But for this session, it would be nice to get as many ideas, as many views as possible. We're also going to get them online. Welcome to our online guests. They will be joining in with the Q&A. I will only make one point about it. I haven't a great love for borders, for control posts, for barbed wire, for mines. I've been across quite a number of those. The only border that is now coming well into people's discussion is the one between Northern Ireland and the Republic. I can confirm one wonderful thing about it, that if you go looking for it, as I did one morning, and ended up in a farmhouse, having travelled from Belfast with this very nice woman who sat us down on the sofa and said, before we begin to talk about the border, would you like a cup of tea? And I said, yes. She said, well, I'll go into the Republic and put the kettle on. Proceeded to walk into the kitchen. Sadly, the rest of the world is not like that. The rest of the world, as we have seen recently, and particularly in bits and pieces on the media, and certainly without the kind of detail and expertise we have from our panel here, it is one of the discussion points, a political football, and very much an emotional subject, which takes up a good deal of thought these days, and has not gone away, and looks as if it is going to pose us with many more questions in the future. Let me introduce the panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Joanne Liu, International President of Médecins Sans Frontières. She first started working with MSF in 1996 and has since worked to support people affected by natural disasters and within conflict zones, including Palestine, Central African Republic, and Sudan's Darfur region. Our next speaker is Professor Heaven Crawley, Chair of International Migration at Coventry University's Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations. She's written extensively on a wide range of asylum and immigration issues, including the causes of migration to Europe. Then we have Ahmad al-Rashid, a Syrian campaigner from Aleppo who now lives in London. Ahmad fled Aleppo to Kurdistan due to the conflict before making a perilous 2-month journey across Europe, arriving in the UK hidden in the back of a lorry. He now holds an MSc in Violence, Conflict and Development from SOAS. And our final speaker this evening is Dr. Jessica Hagen-Zanker, a research fellow for migration at ODI, focusing on understanding how migration and other policies affect migrant decision-making and migration and development. Experts all, so ears pricked up as I ask Dr. Joanna Liu, the International President of MSF, to give a sense and give us an overview of the Mediterranean migrant crisis.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I'm sorry, I have a cold. I just traveled from overseas, so bear with me. So what I wanted to share with you, and the reason why MSF associated, you know, MSF hates to be associated with anything. So being associated with this event is like a big deal, just for you to know. But it's the fact that we could recognize ourselves in that work. And because it's about journeys of people, and it's what I call journeys of survival. Journeys of people who have no choice. And so last September, upon my return from Libya, we MSF had an open letter. We accused the EU government of colluding with criminals. We called it the business of despair. And those were strong words, but I guess they were not strong enough because they were not picked up. But the thing is, for me, was to talk about what is going on and the obsession of Europe about decreasing the number of people basically reaching the beaches, the shore of Europe, is the cost of while we are self-celebrating the decreasing number is a human cost. And the thing is, in Libya, MSF has been working in detention center, and I went there, and I think that for me, after 20 years of working at the front line of all the crises of this world, was the most extreme incarnation of men's cruelty. I'm still haunted by those images. And I remember very well, when I went to visit this prison, everybody knew I'm the international prison. Everybody knew that I might speak out afterwards. And so I remember very well in that center in Libya, and there's this huge man, 400 pounds, and he just said, "You want to see the cell?" I said, "Yes, come." And then he opened the door, and then he has a wooden stick in his hand, and he's like, smacking like this, and people just retrieve like this. And what I saw was hundreds of eyes in emaciated faces looking at me, reaching out with their hands and asking me, "Save me, save me." I was speechless. I don't know what to tell them. But I promised myself that my organization will speak out about it. And we tell the rest, we will tell the rest of the world that the cost of the deterrent, of the closing border, is a human cost. It's a cost where we've created island of no rights, where people are abusers over and over again. I could not erase that thought of that woman who told me, who whispered to me when I was doing the rounds in the hospital where we refer people, that she just said, "You know what? They are singling out pregnant women, and they make sure that we know they're raping them every night as a way to enslave." And then today we're using public money to enable this. And I think that in the comfort of that warm room tonight, our discussion needs to bring some action. And then so I don't have the specific action, but I know that if we do not stand and let this happen, we are basically denying part of our humanity, not recognizing the humanity of people who are fleeing for their life or fleeing for better life. It's the beginning of denying our own humanity. And that's my plea to you tonight about all this conversation that you're going to have and about all those amazing data that people's going to share and studies they've done on 500 peoples, that we need to take a stand and not let ourselves being basically intellectualize the issue. It's about life, It's about human being. People are trying to basically get the same thing as you want. You know, and if people were saying, you were saying there was a very emotional topic. It is a very emotional topic. You know, I am the product of migration. And I'm just going to tell you that it's completely unbeatable. Completely unbeatable. The motivation for parents to offer a future for their children. All the sacrifice that everybody does, and that's exactly what people are doing. They're doing that for themselves, they're doing that for their family. So we have data, and we're just going to tell you that basically, for example, in Greece, we've looked at people. We have people, you know, coming for the common things, the cold, the burn, a lot of burn because they're trying to warm themselves while winter is here. But the other thing, it's about mental health. And what we see in all our data is people's physical health and mental health is deteriorating in all those hotspot detention center holding area that we have created in Europe, in the first world. And so when I was there in Samos a few months ago, people are committing suicide. They left war to be parked in those islands of no rights to end up committing suicide. Actually, our waiting list in Samos is more than 400 people who wants to see our psychiatrist. Counseling is not good enough. They need to see a psychiatrist. So before I wrap up, I cannot not talk about Bangladesh, although we're talking about Europe. That's my cold. Because I was just there, and I know that we're gonna have the same thing. We're gonna have the same repeat history. It's about people again who are stateless, nameless, and statusless, and they are left in the limbo of policies. And then you know, we have been interested by it because it was such I would say a massive exodus. But the reality, it's already off the news right now. But we have the same problem. It's across the world. So, and then the psychological trauma is the same. And today, with the Bangladesh and the Myanmar people are saying, you know, you're going to return back to where you are. And then basically, you know, you're going to return with your oppressor. And then these are what our policies are doing. They're not addressing what people are needing. They're needing a safe place. And as well, we are basically only, I would say, building policies to return back where they are coming, which is from oppression. And so my last thing is to say that I just want to tell you that I don't know what to say anymore to convince people that something needs to happen. I am running out of words. And then the only thing I can say, and I know that I'm not allowed to say that in the name of MSF, so I'm going to say it under my name, is the fact that the European greedy, protective, deterrent policy that are going on right now has a human cost. And as far as I'm concerned, that's going to be a moral stain in our collective history. And I think it's up to us to change the course of history. So thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Now going on to Professor Helen Crawley, Chair of International Migration at Coventry University's Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations. Your recent book draws on the first-hand accounts of the 500 new arrivals to Europe in 2015, which we heard in the introduction. Can you give a sense of how journeys to Europe are made, about the methods, the routes, and the reasons?
Okay, thank you. I mean, I'd like to begin just by thanking Joanne, actually, partly for writing the foreword to the book, but also just reminding us of the humanity that underpins the issues that we're talking about. And I mean, we did this research at what you might call the height of the crisis, by which in European terms is described in terms of the largest numbers of people who are arriving across the Mediterranean. Now, of course, put in a global context, this is not a crisis numerically, but what it came to represent politically and in terms of the lives of those who were arriving, some of whom we were talking to, was indeed a personal crisis for those people. We interviewed 500 people, as has already been mentioned, over the course of just 3 or 4 months, and it was challenging and difficult, but we thought it was important because we wanted to collect almost in real time the stories of people who are arriving, to unpack and challenge some of the very dominant narratives that were already at that point starting to become very hard, very firmly formed in terms of both the political and the public and media narratives. We talk quite a lot in the book about, there's a reason why migration crisis is in parenthesis. We put it in parenthesis because the idea of crisis is really not one of numbers, but about the kind of failures of politicians and politics more generally to respond to the kinds of things that we've been hearing about. But we also talk in the book about the certain set of circumstances, particularly in relation to the Libyan situation, but also in terms of Syria, and how that came to coalesce, if you like, in 2015 with a certain situation unfolding on the beaches of Europe. And I think before I just say something about the journeys and what we found about the journeys, it's worth just reminding ourselves that the view from Europe is indeed the view from Europe. So this is very much the representation of what was happening in 2015. And you would think from this kind of this is a BBC representation as it happens, but based on UNHCR data. So there are worse ones, put it that way. But from that representation, all of the movement to Europe starts on the beaches, right, in the coast of North Africa and elsewhere. And of course, the focus is entirely on Europe itself. And what you see if you start to look beyond that is a very much more complicated picture of how it is that people come to be in Europe in the first place. And if you look back one further, if you like, go out geographically from our European focal point, you'll see, of course, that actually Europe just becomes this really rather small area in the top left-hand corner. And actually what's going on is a much more complicated set of journeys and movements within and across borders. And this is, of course, just the African context. You've got a global context where migration is happening in all sorts of different ways that we don't often hear about. So what we wanted to do, if you like, in the research is to unpack these backstories, to kind of understand more of what was going on and is still going on that might have led people to make the decision, a few of the total of people who are moving across the Mediterranean itself. So I just really want to highlight 3 sets of findings in particular. Obviously, we go into much more detail in the book. And one of the reasons we wrote the book was because although we'd produced, I think, 4 policy reports as the project unfolded, precisely because we wanted to get these stories into the public frame as these policy developments were occurring, is because we wanted to capture the stories in more detail. And particularly what we do in the book that's different than some of the other outputs we've produced from the project is to really try and capture the essence of people's the backstories, the lives that exist well before the arrival on a beach of Europe or beyond. Because if you start to see people as human beings rather as migrants who come to Europe, then actually there has a whole series of things going on in their lives that lead to that particular outcome. So the first finding, I think, which is worth highlighting and which is very prominent in the book is that, as Martha has already said, while some people specifically wanted to come to Europe, actually it was a very small proportion of the people that we spoke to. Most people, the vast majority, had initially travelled to neighbouring countries. They'd initially travelled to get safety, or they'd travelled to get work in some cases. Then, for a whole range of different reasons, and it is really important not to generalise about this, they had decided to move on. Now, the situation in Libya has become more well documented over the last 6 months, I would say, but of course it's been like that for many years. And when we talked to people about those experiences in Libya, they told us in graphic detail some of the things that had happened to them. And I have to say, I think the stories that we heard coming out of Libya were some of the most horrendous of all the stories that we heard during our research. We also spoke to many Syrians who talked about their initial need to leave Syria, and then their difficulty in rebuilding a life elsewhere. So they talked about being in a camp in Jordan or Lebanon, about the difficulties of securing access to education for their children, healthcare for their family members, being in Turkey and unable to work in ways that would allow them to build anything like a future for themselves. But they also talked about that lack of having a sense of belonging anywhere, the lack of papers, the inability to know that there was a sense of a future. And so the people that we spoke to had never necessarily intended at the outset to come to Europe, but in the context of those situations in Libya and in Jordan and Lebanon and elsewhere, had decided to move on. Which kind of brings me to our second point, which is it's not really, although our book is subtitled Journeys Over Land and Sea, actually it's not really in many cases accurate to talk about journeys at all, because journeys implies a singular movement. It implies that you get on a plane or a boat or make a decision at point A, and then you end up at point B. And the fact is that for many of the people arriving in 2015, and of course since and before, the point at which they ended up in Europe was the end of a long and often complicated, protracted and fragmented journey, which had involved multiple migration decisions, and had often in some cases involved periods of months, years, tens of years in other countries. So for example, the cases that stand out, I think, particularly in the book, are Afghans living in Iran, for whom the decision to move was often as a consequence not just of what was happening in Afghanistan, because many of them were born in Iran or had lived in Iran for many years, but a combination of the situation for Afghans in Iran, which is one of discrimination and marginalization, fears of being returned to Afghanistan, where there is also conflict, forced recruitment, or not exactly forced, but persuaded recruitment into the Iranian army to work to fight in Syria, and then seeing that there might be hope beyond that, and people moving into Europe. So there was no singular factor that drove them on that decision to move, but rather this combination. So I think it's really important, as Martha says, that we need to look at the in-between, the factors that shape and influences people's decisions to move on beyond that initial decision to leave a country of origin. And I think the main finding of the book, in a way, and of the research project as a whole, is that the focus has been so fixated on that top left-hand corner that the policy orientation of policy thinking has really been about how to stop and reduce the flow into Europe without in any way, shape or form considering those factors that lead that to be the case in the first place. And if you have this very simplistic push-pull idea of why people move, then actually your policy apparatus becomes incredibly limited by that, because you're actually left with very few tools other than, as we're seeing, putting up these kinds of barriers. So for us, it's really about how you engage with let's call it root causes, although root causes has become a slightly problematic term, but root causes that goes beyond just the initial conflict, but the other factors that are going into the pot in terms of shaping people's journeys. And I just want to conclude really by giving you one example of the unintended consequences of policy, because we've seen so many of those over these last few years, and not just in Europe, actually, more generally. So many of the Eritreans that we spoke to talked about their journey initially to other parts of Eritrea and then across the border to Sudan. And one of the stories that runs through the book, and it's not their real names, but one of the couples that we talked to in the book, and report in the book, started off that journey initially going to Sudan, thinking that they could build a life there, that they could have their life there together. And then after a year, deciding that actually that was going to be impossible, and feeling increasingly anxious about the possibility of being returned to Eritrea and then back into this forced conscription. And one of the ironies of the European policy response has been that as a consequence of the Khartoum process, European governments are now paying effectively the Sudanese government to clamp down on irregular migrants in the Sudan, and therefore picking people up on the street and sending them back to Eritrea. So that couple's decision to leave the Sudan and eventually come to Europe through Libya as it happened and not with a good experience on the way, was driven in significant part by European policy. So that kind of goes, I know Jessica's going to talk about this more in her presentation, but this is the problem. If you look only at that top left-hand corner and you ignore all those backstories, then you can actually end up doing things that exacerbate not just the problem as far as Europe defines it, but also the experience of the people who are actually on the move.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's move on now to Ahmed al-Rashid, who's a Syrian campaigner from Aleppo and who now lives in London. You arrived in London after a perilous journey across Europe from Syria via Kurdistan in northern Iraq. Could you tell us some of the factors in your decision to travel to Europe, and take us through some of the journey?
Thank you very much for having me here. I would like to start by saying I never wanted to leave my country. I did not want to leave my family, my friends, my language, my history, my loved ones, my everything behind, and to come to Europe where I do not know anyone. I've got no clue about the people, the perceptions, whatever. It was a very, very hard decision to make in 2013, late 2012, when there was no way to stay in eastern Aleppo at that time because of the dropping of barrel bombs, and at the same time, the knives of Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra and other radical element groups at that time. At that time, it was not called ISIS, the Islamic State, but still it was an extremist group. So I've decided to move to the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Though I was in Aleppo, it was easier for me to move to Turkey. But I decided to go to northern Iraq because I'm Kurdish, I speak Kurdish. I've got friends there who moved there last year or something before. So it made it easier for me. We've got other contacts, I speak the language. So I moved there and it was great for me. I got a job, I joined the UN, I worked for the UNICEF for some time as a communication for development. It was a great experience. But at the same time, it was heartbreaking because I saw thousands and thousands of fellow Syrians, after surviving the bombing, the shelling, the sieges, when they made it to the border, and, they were bussed and they were dropped in a no man's land, and they were surrounded by a fence, and they were surrounded by the security forces. And these people thought that probably it's going to be a week, 2, a month or so they can go back. Today it's almost 7 years, and over 7 years, and soon it will be 1 decade since the conflict, or the Arab Spring started. 1 decade, and time flies, and these people, prior to their flight, for me, I've met hundreds of these people, doctors, engineers, teachers, journalists, people from different walks of life, and most importantly, Syria was a middle-income country. It was not a poor country. We produced labor to the other parts of the Arab world, and we got, tourism, and we've got thousands of Europeans and Americans and North Americans and people from different parts of the world coming to us, and praising us about our hospitality, to Palestinians, for a very long time, though I've got a lot of reservation about how the government, welcomed the Palestinians, or how we welcomed, people in Iraq after the invasion of Iraq, or then in 2006 after the clashes between, or the troubles between Israel and Hezbollah. But again, it was for people, when you flee, you are in this mood of survival, that you focus on the immediate things, that I want water, food, and safety. But once you settle in, you get to this idea that, it's not only about surviving, you need to thrive. I am a doctor, but here I'm selling vegetables and fruits, and my children cannot go to school, and I am not allowed to work. And if I'm a refugee in Lebanon, I'm about over 50% of Syrians, they do not attend school. We are talking about a lost generation. Everyone talks about the conflict would come to an end. So we want to rebuild. Who is going to rebuild this country if over 50%, of the students or the children are out of education? If the Syrians, over 50% with Syrians, with university degree are literally, or secondary degree, are in Europe. This is great news to Europe, because they are the most intelligent, smart people, after losing everything, they're so determined to carry on and rebuild their lives. And those are still there, they are the most vulnerable, or who couldn't afford it. So for me, I've never thought of Europe at that time, after 2 years. But there came a time when the city of Mosul fell with the Islamic State. And I was working at that time, and I saw the enslavement of Yazidis, and I saw the brutality, I saw the killings and then the beheadings. And for me, this was, I thought, like, I fled the Syrian hell. I ended up the Iraqi hell, And at the same time, over 2 million Iraqis, they were internally displaced. And these people in the northern Kurdish region, there's a lot of, they were generous, they were welcoming, but because of the political, social, economic situation, a lot of people are fighting over scarce resources at that time, And then you got the World Food Program cutting food, and people saying, okay, I'm sitting here, no work, no school, sometimes, and now they're cutting food. What shall I do? Sit and die. At the same time, we've got, people who already sometimes, some of them made it to Europe, and we saw like the media attention, and this was the picture of Alan Kurdi that suddenly there's a refugee crisis, in Europe. It is not a crisis for Europe. It's a crisis for Syrians. It's a crisis for Iraqis. It's a crisis for Afghanis. Afghans. It's a crisis for Sudanese. It's a crisis for Eritreans who could not, resume their lives for the last many years. It is a crisis for these people. Europe is the biggest economic, political, whatever bloc on earth, with over 500 million people, with lots of resources. I think they can manage. 85% of these migrants or whatever, refugees, are not in Europe. Yet, these, people are not making a big fuss about it. Why did no one talk about the refugee crisis before 2015? But once it becomes a European crisis or a Eurocentric, it becomes a crisis, and the media and everything, brings attention about it. So for me, I decided to move, and I moved to southeast of Turkey. Southeast of Turkey was unbelievable, because there was clashes between the PKK, the Kurdish insurgents, and being a Kurdish Syrian in that part of the country was a crazy idea. Then I moved to Izmir. There I met another smuggler, who got me to the to Kos Island in Greece, then to Athens. After that, I got a fake passport to Marseille in France, then to Calais 2 weeks. Then I ended up in the UK. But again, when I talk about smugglers, today if you go to social media, for some Syrians, smugglers are national heroes. Literally, and I'm not exaggerating, because these are the Robin Hoods, who are very good at beating, Coast Guards and security services and the police, and making these people, the desperate people, to reach their destination. But again, the majority of these people do not want to come to Europe. The majority are staying near the border in Turkey, in Jordan, in Turkey over 3 million people, are Syrians. In Jordan, about over 600,000 people. In Lebanon, over 100 million, over 1 million people. It's about 25% of their population. In Iraq, over 250,000 people. These people do not want to come to Europe. And I've seen some people, they got contacted by UNHCR or other for resettlement. They said, no, we do not want to go. We're just hoping that the conflict would come to an end so we can go back to our lives. They do not want to come to Europe. There's some people, obviously, the young people, if you look again at this idea of they're all young people, of course. I'm talking about a conflict of half a million people lost their lives. The majority are young people, because they are the fuel, they are the target of the government, of the militias, And again, these people do not want, to come to Europe. They're hoping that one day the conflict comes so can go back. But sadly, there's been no solution. There's been absolutely, no solution, especially when you have got nothing to lose. Once you lost your family members, your job, your entitlements, nothing, you've got nothing to lose. It's just a trip, it's just short, probably 31 hour, 2 hour, 3 hours, 1 day journey, and you get to the European land or the European dream or whatever they call it. It used to be the American dream, now it's a European dream. You've got nothing to lose. You made it, and you're there. Because again, I remember, I've got people in Iraq and in Turkey. When we're there, they said, you are our brothers and sisters, you are guests. For instance, the narrative in Turkey at that time, we are welcoming, our Sunni brothers and sisters in Turkey who are fleeing. They are the Muhajirin, and we are, the Ansar. We are welcoming them. They're using a very religious term. But again, this idea of, it's not a rights-based, what does this a guest mean? What are my limits? For how long I can be a guest? And when you see also, like, for instance, like someone got married to Europe, that, okay, I've got 5 years leave to remain, for instance, I can access these services, I can apply, I can study, I can work, It means that I have opportunities, that my children will have opportunities. But for a lot of people there, you've got no refugee status, you've got, I don't know, the different names or categories, and people do not feel comfortable because they feel that the conflict might even drag one more decade. So to finish off, just to conclude, it's very important to note, these people, they did not want to leave. They do not want to leave. They are hoping that the international community would come to bring an end to this human carnage in the 21st century that they kept saying, no more again, but it's happening again and again and again and again. So I'm hoping that they will be able to address the root causes of the crisis. Building walls is not going to solve the problem. Always people will find a ways. Building walls and it's not going to solve the problem. Never, ever. Well, it might reduce it, but it's not going to solve it. So also the last thing I would like to make, and I'm sorry if I've been over my time. The journeys, does not end when people set foot on the European soil. This is just the beginning of a new journey. The journey of integration, the journey of assimilation, is a very long journey. Some people succeed, some people do not succeed. So the story does not end when I put, my feet on the European soil. It's just a new story. It's just a new start. So for a lot of these people, and I keep repeating the same thing every time, for a lot of these people back in Syria and beyond, they had jobs. Today they are jobless. Many of these people, they had homes. A lot of these people today are homeless. The only thing today, that these people have is hope. Hope in the international community or policymaker. The only thing they have, hope. So please do not make them hopeless. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ahmed Al-Rashid. Jessica.
Thank you.
There's been much debate in Europe about push versus pull factors in why people choose to actually travel to Europe. And Europe's response, for the most part, has been guided by government strategies of containment, restriction, deterrence. For example, the EU-Turkey deal. Do you think that these approaches will be successful in deterring migrant journeys to Europe?
Thank you. So I'm going to present research that I conducted around a similar time as Heaven and colleagues. So this was in the summer of 2015, and my colleague Rich Mallet and I set out to ask the question, is it possible to change someone's mind about migrating? At the time, policy responses in Europe, as indeed they're still today, were focused about stopping flows. And these responses took two main forms. So one were direct control measures. So these are your borders, fences, and your coast guards in Libya. And the other were deterrent measures. And these are things like anti-migration campaigns, which try to change people's minds before they even set out on the journey to Europe. So just to give you one example quickly, the government of Denmark took out some ads in Lebanese newspapers a few years ago. And in these ads, they described tightened asylum regulations in Denmark for asylum seekers. And in this way, they try to stop people from even think about coming to Denmark. And this is just one example of many. So our study explored whether such an approach works. And we did this by investigating decision-making processes amongst 52 refugees and other migrants who had arrived in Europe. and we looked at their journeys and the decisions they made at different points of their journeys along the way. So to answer your question whether these approaches work, I'm going to give you 3 key findings from our research. And the first one is that deterrence doesn't drastically alter the migration decision, and that is exactly what you said just now. We found that anti-migration messages are unlikely to drastically change people's decisions about coming to Europe in the first place. We found, again, like you said, that people made that decision because they felt they had no choice. They were fleeing war, oppression, violence, and limited opportunities. And they made that decision on the basis of trusted information. And this is information that is conveyed through their social network, through family and friends. And we found that the information that governments share just doesn't feature in these networks. And in fact, we found that migration policies rarely featured in migration decisions. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. But before I do that, I want to show you the actual journey of one person we interviewed, and to show you how Musa moved on despite being exposed to constant anti-migration messages on his journey. So this is Musa, who is from Damascus, and we interviewed him in Berlin in 2015. And Musa decided to leave Damascus when the bombings just got worse and worse. And he decided to move on with his family. And he made the journey that was very familiar from the news at the time. So he moved to Turkey and then to Greece, and then crossed into Macedonia and was walking in Macedonia, was walking on foot to Serbia when he was exposed to direct anti-migration messages for the first time. So he was caught by the Macedonian police, and they took him and his travel companions and returned him to Greece. But this didn't deter Musa from continuing on his journey. As soon as he could, he tried again, and this time he did make it through Macedonia into Serbia. From there, he moved to Hungary, and then in Hungary, he faced the next threat. So he was again caught by police. He was put in a reception center, and in that reception center, he saw other Syrians being beaten with sticks and tasers. Again, this didn't deter him from continuing with his journey. As soon as he was able to leave the reception center, he pushed on to Germany. Our second finding around policies is that diversion is much more likely than prevention. And we found that migration policies, that control measures can influence the trajectory of people. So what I mean is that migration policies don't stop people from coming to Europe in the first place, but they can influence how they travel and where they go. Essentially moving migration flows from one country to the next. So the examples that you immediately think of as well is, for example, the Hungarian border. When that fence was erected in the late summer of 2015, flows didn't stop, but they diverted to Croatia and Slovenia instead. And initially, when the Turkey deal was first introduced, we saw that flows to Greece reduced rapidly, immediately, but at the same time, the central Mediterranean route started picking up in terms of numbers again. So direct control measures can divert flows, essentially passing the baton from one country to the next. Now it's currently sitting at the edges of Europe, but they don't prevent migration from happening in the absolute sense. And then our final finding is that jobs and education are what really matters. We found that it wasn't migration policies that shaped people's decisions. It was broader public policies around access to education for their kids and themselves. It was labor market opportunities, and it was safety and human rights. And it was basically about finding a place where you can make a future. So to come back to Musa, So Musa did eventually make it to Germany, and he said he wanted to go there because it's a country where you can find work. And we heard similar sentiments across many of our other interviews. And on the whole, almost half of our respondents were influenced by public policies on education or work in terms of their migration destination decision. So we drew a number of policy recommendations from our work. We concluded that policymakers should be stepping away from unilateral migration measures to a more coordinated approach, because as we heard already today, migration is not just a movement from A to B, it's a much more complicated process than that. We also found, like Heaven, that journeys tend to be protracted, expensive, and risky, and that the experiences along the journey, along the way, shape where people end up. Because deterrent policies have little effect on stopping overall migration movements, what should be done is to manage migration better. And we suggested that one way to do that is to focus on the 3 stages of the migration process. So the first one is about making journeys safer. So we all know the numbers. We know that those people that did make it often pay a fortune and had very traumatic experiences. Part of that policy recommendations is about actually making the journey safer, so search and rescue missions. But of course, crossing the Mediterranean is just one part of a risky journey, and there needs to be a greater focus on protecting people before they even reach the shores of the Mediterranean, so including in places like Libya. We also found that people travel on these risky journeys because they have lost faith in formal mechanisms, or because they don't have access to these mechanisms in the first place. So the key way to make journeys safer is to offer them these mechanisms in the first place, and is to increase and diversify legal migration pathways. And a number of different examples have been put forward in recent years, including humanitarian visas, skills or jobs matching, temporary migration schemes, quota enlargements, and study scholarships. The second point is around making a faster and fairer asylum system. We all know that EU member states treat and process asylum claims unevenly, and these shape trajectories of refugees, but also lead to very unequal outcomes. And on the whole, this is creating a small number of winners, but a large number of losers, which are the border countries in Europe, and also hundreds and thousands of asylum seekers. In 2016, a quota system, the so-called fairness mechanism, was introduced, but it hasn't had much impact so far, and only 5% of the relocation target has been met. So more pressure needs to be put on member states who are refusing to play their part. It's also a great concern, actually, in recent days that even progressive role models like Germany are now considering upper limits in asylum applications. So definitely more needs to be done here. And the final point is around the really big economic and social benefits to be had from migration for migrants and their communities, but also host and origin countries. And our recommendation is that policymakers should make the most of the social and economic benefits to be had from migration. And examples include investing in integration programs for new arrivals, but importantly, increasing the opportunities for legal migration. When we wrote this report 2 years ago, I'd say the last point was probably the most contested in the very toxic public debate that was going on at the time. It hasn't changed that much, but I do have a sense that things are shifting. And the 2 compacts that are currently being discussed, the one on migration and refugees, do present huge opportunities to reap more of the benefits to be had of migration. And just last week, the UN Secretary General published a report that will be an input to the 0 draft of the migration report, and I was pleased to see that it was entitled Making Migration Work for All, and the focus was already much more on the opportunities to be had from migration rather than the so-called migration crisis, which we've seen in previous reports.
Thank you very much indeed. There's a wealth of experience you've heard from the panel, and the complexities of the subject are daunting, but they're also realistic. And I'm sure it stimulated some questions. If you'd like to ask a question, just pop up your hand, and would you state your name and your organization if that's relevant. And we look right around. I'm going to start right at the back there to begin with.